Special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time today. If you want to see any previous sessions, you can search Times of Crisis and Possibility on the JTS website, and all previous sessions will come up. Today's session will be posted there soon, and all future sessions. JTS's Department of Community Engagement exists to share the riches of JTS with the Jewish community at large, the community at large. So we're really pleased to be doing that through this series today. I'm using phone and computer simultaneously because something is going on with the video on my computer. Anyway, so we're really excited about today's session, Literature as Lifeline, What Were Jews Reading and Writing in the Ghettos, with our JTS fellow, Edna Friedberg, who I'm going to introduce at more length in a couple of minutes. Just first, a few announcements and technical instructions for today. So first of all, thank you to my colleague, Rabbi Tim Bernard, our Director of Digital Learning, who's facilitating today's session, and several other members of the community engagement team for helping to put this series together. Some technical instructions, which you probably know by now, but just in case, if you'd like to focus on Dr. Friedberg when she's teaching, you want to click speaker view in the top right, as opposed to gallery view. You can toggle back and forth between those if you'd like, but probably mostly you'll want to be focusing on her. If she does any screen sharing, just so you know, once her screen is shared, there's a little view options menu. You can make various adjustments, and you can move the vertical line back and forth to change the relative size of the picture of her or the image that she's sharing. We're going to be using the raise hand feature in Zoom for questions as opposed to the chat. You're welcome to use the chat for whatever you think is appropriate, but for questions, we'd like to use the raise hand feature. So to find that, click on Participants, which is on the lower the menu bar going across the bottom. When you click that, you should see a hand icon to raise your hand. Click the hand to lower it, click it again. If you're participating by phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand, and again, *9 to lower your hand. And Tim will call on you if it's your turn to ask a question, and then you will unmute yourself to ask your question. And I think that's most of that's all the announcements. You should have received the sources for today's class in the email with the Zoom link. And now it's my really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Edna Friedberg, who is a JTS fellow and a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's a graduate of the University of Illinois, and then received her PhD in Modern Jewish Studies from JTS, where she wrote her dissertations on the origins of American Jewish services for the elderly. Dr. Friedberg joined the staff of the Holocaust Museum in 1999, and she has served as the historian for the museum's highly visited online Holocaust encyclopedia and as director of its Wexner Learning Center. She also curated a special exhibit on the legacy of the Nuremberg trials and post-war justice. Her essays connecting Holocaust history with social, cultural, and political issues today have appeared in The Atlantic, Slate, Newsday, and The Forward. She's an alum of Camp Vermont, Wisconsin, and she serves as president of the Board of Trustees of the Milton Gottesman Jewish Day School of the nation's capital. And as I mentioned last time, our JTS fellows are scholars associated with JTS, often alumni, as in this case, who we think are master scholars and master teachers, and who we want to have associated with us and teaching for us, especially in community learning programs like this. So Dr. Friedberg, thank you so much for teaching us today.
Thank you, Julia. Don't call me Dr. Friedberg. It makes me think that I'm my dad. So thank you very much for that warm introduction, for inviting me. Thank you, Tim, for facilitating this session. And thank you to all of you who are watching from around the country, around the world, whatever time zone you're in. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'd like to begin with a word about JTS specifically, and also to note in gratitude that a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today, I first was introduced to a lot of this material by my teacher and mentor at JTS, professor of literature there, Dr. David Roskies, who knows this material inside out and really shaped my view and the view of my classmates in the graduate program there and in the rabbinical school and other schools, to think about Jews during the Holocaust, not as victims or as survivors, but as fully fleshed out human beings who brought the entire cumulative experience and worldview and relationships and all sorts of things that make us complex human beings into these artificial hellscapes in which they found themselves. So I would not be able to teach this class without the work and learning that I had from David Roskies, and I am very, very grateful. Periodically, I'll be showing you some pictures, but I'm just telling you in advance, especially if you have anyone young watching with you, not showing anything particularly graphic. I don't think that actually enhances learning. I think it gets in the way and is distracting. So let me begin with a few voices, actually, a few voices from ghettos themselves, because really the goal, if you take nothing else away from this session, I will be pleased and feel that you've gotten my point if you let the Jewish men, women, teenagers, children who were living in ghettos in Nazi-occupied Europe speak for themselves, then you will have gotten to the heart of the matter. A few quotes from the Lodz Ghetto in Poland, or Łódź in Polish. A man named Józef Zelkovich wrote in September 1942, and by the way, I should note, you'll have these in your source sheet. If you have that packet, I will not be going in order. I'm starting with the first few that are there, and we will not have time to get to all of them in the course of the program, but I wanted to give you as many avenues for exploration later as we can. When I'm going out of order, I'll tell you what number I'm at, but I am beginning with number 1. So Józef Zelkovich, writing in September 1942, he wrote something for the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto, which was a self-conscious, intentional effort by Jews imprisoned there to document for the future, for people who might read this when they themselves were gone, what they were experiencing. And he wrote these words: "Listen and believe this, even though it happened here, even though it seems so old, so distant, and so strange." Another resident, Jakub Poznański, who had worked as an engineer before the war, wrote, "Any moment now, the search will begin. If they find our hiding place, I will leave these notebooks in the dungeon. They might be our last trace." And Józef Zelkovich, who I quoted at the beginning, who had been a journalist before the war, wrote these words as a call to people he would never know. "Son of man, go out into the streets. Soak in the unconscious terror of the newborn babies about to be slaughtered. Be strong. Keep your heart from breaking so you'll be able to describe carefully and clearly what happened in the ghetto during the first days of September in the year 1942. And finally, a third voice from the Lodz Ghetto, a physician named Jakob Schulman, wrote this: "I want to be able to record for posterity what I have seen. I deem it my duty to report, if not as a finished, systematically researched work of history, then at least as source material for the objective historians who will come later." So I begin with this array of voices to show you also that the idea, the concept, and the perspective of writing for a future, of hoping that someone would find these traces of them, was not something unique to a handful of individuals in ghettos, which are primarily in occupied Poland, but was a mindset, a worldview that permeated many, many such places. So let's set the scene. Let's talk about these places. What were they like? And when we think about them in their day-to-day physical realities, how much more extraordinary that people would take energy and creativity away from their daily act merely of surviving, which is a form of resistance, to channel it into this kind of documentation. By any measure, the Warsaw Ghetto was hell on earth. An urban prison zone in the middle of German-occupied Warsaw, the Polish capital. After November 1940, the ghetto was enclosed by a 10-foot high wall, topped with barbed wire and tightly guarded. To give you a sense of just how crowded, how noisy, how smelly it would have been there, German authorities packed over 400,000 Jews of all ages into an area of just 1.3 miles. Works out to an average of more than 7 people living in every room. Conditions were miserable: inadequate food, no sanitation, little heat, clearly no privacy. And by mid-1942, from the conditions alone, 83,000 Jews had died there of starvation or disease. Of those who managed to survive, later in 1942, German authorities had deported almost 300,000 of them to the Treblinka killing center to be gassed. And yet, in Warsaw and in many other ghettos across occupied Poland, Jews organized clandestine schools and libraries, smuggling in books and other cultural materials in collective acts of spiritual resistance. What were these books? What were they reading? Arguably, the most popular book in the Warsaw Ghetto was a novel called The 40 Days of Musa Dagh by Austrian-Czech writer Franz Werfel. The Nazis had burned Werfel's earlier writings in May 1933 as part of their book burnings that were designed to purge German culture of what they saw as dangerous influences. They had labeled Werfel's works as the poison fruits of a Jewish author who advocated pacifism, love for all mankind, and hostility to extreme nationalism, and by extension then, Nazism. First published in Austria, just a few months after the Nazi book burnings, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh detailed the systematic expulsion and murder of 1 million Armenian Christians by authorities in the Ottoman Empire in 1915 to 16, a series of actions that we now refer to as the Armenian Genocide. Based on actual events, Werfel shone a light on a group of Armenian men fighting under desperate conditions. They were under siege. Quickly translated from its original German into many languages, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh was critically acclaimed and widely read in both the United States and Europe, except in Nazi Germany, where it was soon banned. And Tim, if we could bring up the first slide, please. Werfel cast, and this is a cover of a paperback edition in English. Werfel cast the Armenian characters' armed revolt against their oppressors in a heroic vein. As the editor of the New York Times Book Review described the novel in 1933, and I quote, "It is a story which must rouse the emotions of all human beings, a story of men accepting the fate of heroes. It gives us the lasting sense of participation in a stirring episode of history." And when you're looking at the very romantic drawing that's on the cover of this book, I also want to point out, let you know that there was, in fact, during the war, an intention to turn it into a major motion picture starring Clark Gable. And in fact, Louis Mayer, the Hollywood studio head, according to reports, actually bowed to Turkish pressure to not produce the film. And anyone who has familiarity with the Armenian genocide that will know that even today, that is very contested history and one that Turkish authorities would really like to cover up. Let's keep that up another second. I want to read you a brief excerpt from the novel, and to also picture that people in ghettos are reading these words. Quote, "For many people, it is depressing even to move house. A lost fragment of life always remains. To move to another town, settle in a foreign country is for everyone a major decision. But to be suddenly driven forth within 24 hours from one's home, one's work, the reward of years of steady industry, to become a helpless prey of help, to be sent defenseless out to Asiatic high roads with several thousand miles of dust, stones, and morass before one, to know that one will never again find a decently human habitation, never again sit down to a proper table. Yet this is all nothing. To be more shackled than any convict, to be counted as outside the law, a vagabond whom anyone has the right to kill unpunished." And we can take down the slide. It doesn't take much imagination to see how words such as the ones you just heard would resonate with Jewish men and women and teenagers during the Holocaust. Just a few years after its publication, indeed, Werfel's tale of a besieged people taking control of its destiny captured the imagination of those imprisoned in German ghettos. Copies of the novel were passed from hand to hand among members of Jewish youth groups who were marshaling the courage to mount their own armed revolts. When leaders of the underground movement in the Bialystok ghetto debated whether to take arms, they specifically invoked Werfel's book. A young man there wrote, "Only one thing remains for us, to organize collective resistance in the ghetto at any cost, to consider the ghetto our Musa Dagh, to write a proud chapter of Jewish Bialystok and our movement into history," end quote. Many leaders of the resistance in the famous Warsaw Ghetto uprising also drew strength from the struggle at Musa Dagh. And across Europe, Jews in mortal danger looked back one generation to the annihilation of the Armenians, and they saw themselves. Tim, let me know when you want to pause for questions, by the way. I can pause really whenever you like.
We can pause wherever you have a good break. So
okay.
If you'll have questions, you can raise your hands. And you can also raise your hands when it's not time for questions, and we'll call on you when the time comes.
If there aren't hands yet, I can just keep. Oh, there is. Okay. Oh, just a thank you. Thank you, Peter Cohen. All right, then I'll just keep talking for a bit.
There's one question from Leonard.
Okay.
Yes. The American ambassador to Istanbul during World War I, Morgenthau, famously, I believe, spoke up against the Armenian genocide. Was there any role that either that or other public responses to that had in the 30s or leading up to World War II?
Yes, the answer is yes, and you're absolutely right. And we're talking about Henry Morgenthau Sr., so the father then of Henry Morgenthau Jr., who may be familiar to some people here because he becomes the Treasury Secretary during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and his wife, Eleanor Morgenthau, was a close associate of Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a long story, but the capsule answer is that the genocide of the Armenians, although they didn't use that word then, it wasn't coined until the 40s, but the violence against the Armenians was really galvanizing and set a perspective about international aid for Americans, not just Jews, in a way that had not been seen before. That's the first time in US history that you really see mass calls for raising funds on behalf of a group of people who are suffering far away, kind of the precursor to what we think of as telethons today. And it also profoundly shaped Morgenthau's views about interventionism. So I think it's fair to say that the Morgenthau family and then many Americans writ large would not have reacted in the same way to the plight of Jewish refugees in the 30s without these echoes of the Armenians behind them. So that's the short answer.
Robert? Try again, Robert.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm aware that Jabotinsky went from town to town in Eastern Europe and tried to persuade people to leave before the Germans invaded. And apparently he failed. People wouldn't leave. They didn't want to leave their homes. And I'm wondering if Jews were reading this book, 40 Days of Musa Dagh, before they were put in the ghetto, or they just did it after they were put in the ghetto.
They were surely reading it before. As I mentioned, it came out in 1933, 34, depending on what language you were reading it in translation. And so this goes to my point at the beginning about people entering the ghettos with the mindset and worldview that they had before. So some brought the copies with them into the ghetto. Some had it smuggled in because it suddenly felt so relevant to them. Whether or not it affected anyone's decision to try to emigrate, I don't know, because there are so many factors complicating that, not the least of which, as I'm sure people in this crowd will know, was the paucity of places that they could go. So.
Emily?
I was just wondering, is there an indication that Franz Werfel intended when he published the book for it to be kind of a warning, or for it to, because it was when Nazi Germany was already enacting laws against Jews? Did he intend for people to read it as maybe a warning or an allusion to what was going on at the time?
We certainly can say that Werfel was opposed to Nazism and was acutely aware of writing this story at that moment in time. He couldn't have written it with Ghettos in mind, simply because this is 5 years, 6 years before Ghettos are actually created. So not the specific circumstance in which I'm highlighting it here today, but he certainly was an avowed opponent of Nazism, and would have been pleased that it was inspirational. So I think for now I'm going to go on, because I have a lot I want to show you, and I'll be happy to take more questions in a little bit. So hold the thought, make a note. If you're like me, you'll forget what you were going to ask, so make a note. So I want to ask a little more. Sorry, just closing the chat. Someone is asking if we can have questions at the end. You know what? I'm going to leave it to you, Tim, to decide when is the right time. How's that? So I wanted to begin with the 40 Days of Musa, Dagh, partly because I think it's surprising for many people to think about literature being passed around, and not specifically Jewish literature being passed around in ghettos, but to remember that people were living in these artificially created environments, sometimes for years at a time. The Lodz Ghetto was around for 4 years. Other ghettos were there shorter. The Warsaw Ghetto also for years. And so people were not only involved in dying, they were involved in living while they were there. So in ghettos, cultural activity like reading books, like talking about it, constituted a meaningful and life-sustaining form of collective defiance. So I'd like to define a term. What do I mean when I talk about spiritual resistance? I mean actions taken by individuals and groups to maintain their humanity, their personal integrity and dignity in the face here of Nazi attempts to dehumanize and degrade them. In occupied Poland, in ghettos, hundreds of clandestine schools were organized, which is a profoundly optimistic thing to do. To continue to educate children shows that you think or hope that they will have a future, and that they need to continue to learn and develop and grow. Going to and from classes held in apartments and basements, students hid books under their clothing. Jews also opened underground libraries. One in the Polish town of Częstochowa served more than 1,000 readers. Activists also established a 60,000 volume library in the Theresienstadt ghetto near Prague, in what is now the Czech Republic. In ghettos, Jews also engaged, insofar as possible, in a variety of cultural gatherings. And unlike schools, events like these, especially in the early years of the ghetto, were not always forbidden by German authorities. Concerts were held of music, ranging from opera to liturgical music to jazz. There were lectures, there were theatrical productions, cabarets, and art contests. These gatherings offered outlets for stress and emotion, a sense of purpose, and opportunities to gather with others in these artificial and hellish communities. And I'd like to go to the next slide to give just one small example. We have many, many posters and leaflets and things. This is an advertisement for a play in the Warsaw Ghetto. Some of it you might recognize the title. It is Shulamis. It's a Yiddish language play. And the name of the theater, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, is the Novi Azazel. Novi is new in Polish, and Azazel is basically hell, like you wish someone to go to hell in biblical Hebrew. So it's the New Hell Theater, where they are mounting a production of Shulamis by Avram Goldfaden, famous Yiddish playwright. And this is happening in the midst of the ghetto. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next slide shows a rabbi whose name was Yael Teitelbaum. He's in the ghetto of Kolbushova. He's there, I think it's actually a propaganda picture where he's forced to pose for a photograph in his tallis and tefillin. He was later deported to the Rzeszów Ghetto, where he and his two granddaughters were murdered. And actually, I have a special connection because Rzeszów, the ghetto where he was killed, was the birthplace of my father. And Kolbushova, where Rabbi Teitelbaum was the rabbi, was a place where many of my family members lived. But what else were they reading in ghettos? They were reading religious texts. They were reading Sidurim and Chumashim. The Germans forbade religious services in most ghettos, so many Jews prayed and held ceremonies in secret, in cellars, in attics, in back rooms, as others stood guard. And we can take down the slide. In the Warsaw Ghetto alone, in 1940, 600 Jewish prayer groups existed. Rabbinical authorities adjudicated religious disputes on the basis of Jewish law and attempted to adapt halakha to the changed and difficult circumstances in which their congregants found themselves. Prayer helped sustain morale, reaffirmed a cultural and religious identity, and supplied spiritual comfort. Many Orthodox or observant Jews who opposed the use of physical force viewed prayer and religious observance as the truest forms of resistance in which they could engage. Now, likely the best known of these archives, and one that may be familiar to many of you, is that of the Warsaw Ghetto, codenamed Oneg Shabbos or Oneg Shabbat, Joy of the Sabbath, which was founded by Polish Jewish historian Emanuel Ringelblum. The Oneg Shabbos archive was clandestinely compiled between 1940 and 1943. Members of the Oneg Shabbos gathered thousands of testimonies from natives of Warsaw and from hundreds of other localities, people who had been deported and centralized in this ghetto, to create a documentary record of the wartime fate of Polish Jewry. I can show the next slide, please. They gathered these materials and hid them in containers like this milk can that I'm showing you, which is about 3.5 feet high. We have one of them on display at the Holocaust Museum where I work here in Washington, D.C. So some of you may have seen it, or you could come see it. There's another one at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Why in a milk can? If we could go to the next slide. If you think about a container that is devised or engineered to contain liquid, it also keeps liquid out. So it creates a watertight seal, and that's why I'm showing you here the top of what the milk can would look like, this milk jug that it could seal. And so it could create really a quite safe and perfect time capsule. On April 18th, 1943, just one day before the start of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the third and final part of the archive, and it was buried in different locations at different times. I'm simplifying very complicated history, but were buried in different locations under the ghetto. And the day before the uprising began, a third and final part of the archive was placed in a cylindrical box, in a metal box, and buried. Later, with great difficulty, because Warsaw was essentially flattened, and we can take down the slide, in the fighting near the end of the war, leaving city blocks completely unrecognizable, structures gone, no point of orientation. But in September 1946, 10 metal boxes were recovered beneath the ruins of what used to be the Warsaw Ghetto. And the second portion of the archives was uncovered on December 1st, 1950. Final cache was never found. We suspect that it is probably located underneath what is now the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. That's a whole other truth is stranger than fiction story about the archaeology, et cetera, looking for it. But this is this time capsule. So what are in these boxes? Why is this interesting, and why is this related to the topic of today's session? So an army of Sammlers, which is the Yiddish word for collectors, gathered some 35,000 pages of material, which is now housed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, a terrific moving museum exhibition if you ever have the chance to go, once we begin going on planes again and things like that. The majority of materials collected by the members of Oneg Shabbos were written, things like diaries, studies of different aspects of life in the ghetto, which were commissioned secretly. There's historical material, but there are also jokes. I'll be sharing some jokes later. Legends, official records. They also preserved ephemera of ghetto residents, so newspapers, ration tickets, letters and postcards, official German orders, invitations to events organized in the ghetto, school assignments, even really mundane objects like tram tickets and candy wrappers. And these inanimate objects are silent witnesses to a closed universe of a people under siege. So who did this and why, and what do we hear from them about it? Next slide, please, shows us the man who was the galvanizing force behind the Oynig Shabbos, Emanuel Ringelblum, here pictured with his son, Uri. Ringelblum was a historian by training. He was politically a radical leftist, was a teacher. He was born in Buchach, Poland, which is now part of Ukraine. And in 1938, he was sent by the Joint Distribution Committee, to head a relief team in the town of Zabąszyn, Z-B-A-S-Z-Y-N, which may be familiar to some of you as a place where thousands of Polish Jews who were expelled from Germany were stranded as stateless. During the war in the ghetto, Ringelblum was active in other forms of lifting up and strengthening the community. He supervised so-called house committees that provided aid, organized cultural activities, and administered soup kitchens that supplied meals to poorer residents of the Warsaw Ghetto. Later, through a series of events, he was in hiding with his family on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw and was betrayed. Someone denounced him and others in hiding, and in 1944, they were discovered and murdered in the Pawiak prison. And we can go away from the slide now. If you are following along, I'm going to read from excerpt number 9. These are words of Ringelblum. He is talking about what they did, why they were trying to give people this sense, the deliberate, self-conscious attempt to document the calamity that had befallen on his community. And I'll read from the second paragraph. I wish we were a smaller group, because when I'm doing this in person and I can actually see your body language, I have other people read, but for now, you're stuck with me. So these are the words of Ringelblum writing in the summer of 1942. He says, "We deliberately refrained from drawing professional journalists into our work because we did not want it to be sensationalized. Our aim was that the sequence of events in each town," so they're documenting different communities, "the experiences of each Jew, and during the current war, every Jew is a world unto himself, should be conveyed as simply and faithfully as possible. Every redundant word, every literary gilding or ornamentation grated upon our ears and provoked our anger. Jewish life in wartime is so full of tragedy that it is unnecessary to embellish it with one superfluous line. Second, there was the matter of keeping a secret, and as is well known, one of the chief failings of journalists is that they reveal secrets." So I really like this passage, both because of the self-consciousness of it, but also that there's even this glimmer of humor at the end that reminds us that everything here is not a sad violin playing, but that people have the full range of human emotions. And indeed, in the Oynig Shabbos archive, there are also a few full range of political opinions. We are able to get multiple perspectives on the same events. So, for example, Ringelblum and his staff thought that Jewish smugglers who were bringing goods into and out of the ghetto and often extorting people, residents, desperate residents at high prices, they thought they were really heroic and keeping people going. Others viewed them as terrible and as opportunists and people who were just really low lives. Similarly, even though other people some people who contribute to this archive are speaking in really condemning tones of the members of the Jewish Council, the semi-autonomous Jewish authorities in the ghetto, Ringelblum made sure to preserve the diary of the head of the Judenrat, of the head of the Jewish Council, Adam Chernyakov, so that he could speak for himself So it is this multi-perspective archive. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk about a woman named Gustavo Uretsky, who was a member of the staff of the Oyneg Shabbos. She was a writer and a teacher before the war, and in the ghetto, she occupied a very strategic position. She worked as a telephone assistant and a typist at the Jewish Council, which gave her access to many of the Judenrat documents and that she could pass them to the archives. So for example, she gave a transcript of a meeting during which German authorities talk about a big deportation they're planning for the summer of 1942. She was a single mother living in the ghetto with her two sons, Marek and Karol, and she died in January 1943 in a train transport. She and her children died in a train to Treblinka. We have an eyewitness account who says that they probably died from suffocation, from lack of access to air. Gustavo Uretsky described the work of the Oyneg Shabbos, saying, and I quote, "The record must be hurled like a stone under history's wheel in order to stop it." So she really saw this as a bold action, as an act of not physical violence, but of intellectual violence and of defiance, even in these very limited circumstances. Okay, we can go off the slide. What are some other materials in the Oyneg Shabbos? A couple more that I want to share with you. Number 12, if you're following along. On number 12, it will say David Graeber, age 19. Some of the more, everything is hard to read from the Oyneg Shabbos, but some of the more heart-wrenching items that we have in this kind of time capsule come from younger people who contributed and who never lived to see their full potential. Last will and testament of a teenage boy, for example. Just the act of which is terrible to try to imagine that mindset to be in. Here, part of what was buried in that underground cache are words from a boy, a 19-year-old named David Graeber, who wrote in August 1942, which is in the midst of what are known as the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. He wrote this: "What we were unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world, so the world may know. We would be the fathers, the teachers, and educators of the future. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened in the 20th century. May history attest to us." Sorry, I was telling a child to be quiet. So David Graeber has a really mature way of describing what's happening in a way that no 19-year-old boy should have to have. This sense that he will not live to see the future of which he dreams. I want to just ask the hosts if they want to stop for questions or keep going.
Let's stop for just a couple of questions now.
Okay.
George?
Would you please comment about the poetry of the youth done at Theresienstadt? In the book, I never saw another butterfly.
About the drawings or about what?
Both the words and the drawings. I think that again is both of them are forms of what you describe as spiritual resistance, particularly by youth.
Absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar, the question is also about drawings, children's drawings, especially that are preserved from the Theresienstadt, which was part ghetto, part concentration camp, and that really capture in very poignant visuals that children are just children wherever they are, and that they still draw, and they still are curious about the world, and they are still hopeful. And also, one of the things that is most difficult and painful to study about children in these circumstances is that many of them don't know of a life before the war. Some of them were even born in ghettos, and so they just accept and take on the terrible and terrifying realities around them as that's how the world is. We have a number of testimonies from children who survived the war, grew to be adults, where they talk about ways that their parents tried to shelter them, or what it felt like to be a kid in one of these secret schools that I'm talking about. Similarly, in Theresienstadt in particular, music and a camp orchestra that was exploited for propaganda purposes by the Nazis, because they framed Theresienstadt as a sort of model camp for outside consumption. Music also formed a way of resisting. And there's a good movie and play called Defiant Requiem, which talks about music and the collective act of playing together as a way of maintaining spirits. Yeah.
William?
Yeah, just going back to the 40 Days of Musa Dagh for a moment. Do you think that any of the people reading that book realized that the world's ignorance or ignoring the genocide of the Armenians encouraged Hitler in his move to exterminate our people?
I haven't seen any evidence of that kind of really big picture sense. I'm sure there are people who read it and just kind of drew their own conclusion that, look, the world abandoned them. Why should we expect the world to help us? That psychology could actually drive a person or drive a group to actively resist, feeling we can't wait to be rescued. We have to do it on our own. The question really becomes, what do you consider resistance? I'm thinking about a particular testimony that I've seen at the Holocaust Museum from a survivor named Emanuel Ringelblum from Hungary, who referred somewhat bitterly to descriptions of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising as a collective suicide. Why do people celebrate this collective suicide? Because as much as they courageously and against all odds held out much longer than they should have, in the end they knew they couldn't defeat the full might of the German military. And so isn't survival in and of itself, survival of the body, survival of the spirit, a very meaningful form of resistance, and one that may actually have a longer term chance of success? So I leave you with that kind of thoughtful idea. I do want to mention, I'm seeing some people are saying in the comments, and it's true, if you're curious about the Oynik Shabbos archive, I would highly recommend a book by scholar Samuel Kassow, Kassow, and a movie by the same name that came out just last year called Who Will Write Our History, which tells the story in much greater depth. I think we'll take one more question and then go on, because I have a lot more I want to share with you.
Raul?
Is there any evidence of news from the outside influencing the internal mood? In other words, the campaign of Russia was already starting to indicate that the Germans were not invincible.
So the short answer to the question is yes. We have a lot of evidence from diaries, from post-war testimony, from both Jews and non-Jews, of information getting in and out. Ghettos and even concentration camps were permeable spaces, even if they were sealed for the movement of people, which they never were entirely. Information got in. People sometimes had secret radios and would listen to things like Radio Orange, which was Dutch radio. They could get shortwave radio from other neutral or allied countries. And when I talked about smugglers bringing supplies, weapons, food, medicine into ghettos, they also brought information. And that information had a profound effect. So I don't have time to go into it today, but we can see, for example, cases where we know that information got back to ghettos about what was happening in the places that we now know as death camps or killing centers. That absolutely affected morale and also the willingness to resist. Because if you feel like, I always try to encourage people to picture what could someone know in the moment and not project our entire landscape of knowledge about the Holocaust. So if you were in a ghetto, starving to death, seeing people around you dying of TB or typhus, being worked to death, you might think this is as bad as it can get. But once you hear rumors, whether you believe them or not, of shooting operations, of mass killings by poison gas, you start to think, what do I have to lose? So I'm really simplifying complex psychology here, but access to information radically changes the type of documents and mood that we see in some of these sources. I'm going to go on with more sources because we have so many, and I'm happy to stay at the end for longer questions, but I also want to respect people who maybe can't stay like that. I'm going to turn to another source that is preserved in the Oyneg Shabbos archive, this of a man named Leib Golden. And if you have it in the handout, it says number 10, Chronicle of a Single Day. And I'm going to read how he describes a day in the life in the Warsaw Ghetto from Leib Golden, translated from the Yiddish. Yesterday, Friedman died of starvation. Of starvation? When you saw him naked, thrown into the gigantic mass grave, everyone covered his nose with a handkerchief except me and his mother. His throat was cut. Maybe he didn't die of hunger. Maybe he took his own life? Yes. No. People don't take their own lives nowadays. Suicide is something from the good old days. At one time, if you loved a girl and she didn't reciprocate, you put a bullet through your head. At one time, if you were sick with consumption, gallstones, or syphilis, you threw yourself from a 4th floor window in a back street, leaving behind a stylized note with, "It's nobody's fault, and I'm doing the world a big favor." Why don't we kill ourselves now? The pangs of hunger are far more terrible, more murderous, more choking than any sickness. Well, you see, all sicknesses are human, and some even make a human being of the patient, make him nobler. While hunger is bestial, a wild, a rawly primitive thing. If you're hungry, you cease to be human, you become a beast, and beasts know nothing of suicide. And I'll stop there. Again, the biting tone, the sarcasm of it, the grief of it, and Golden and many other writers write extensively about hunger. Hunger becomes really a character, I would say, in many writings from the ghettos. He wrote elsewhere in his Chronicle of a Single Day, it's you and your stomach. It's your stomach in you. It's 90% your stomach and a little bit you. So hunger, the physical needs, the physical suffering and pain of people becomes a larger and larger part of what we see. I'm going to read something brief. If we can go to the next slide, please, Tim. We are looking here at pages of a fantastically interesting diary that we are very lucky to have in our collection at the Holocaust Museum in Washington from a man named Chaim Kaplan. This diary was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He kept it. Chaim Kaplan, before the war, had been an instructor of Bible. He was a Hebrew linguist, and he writes this diary in a really beautiful literary Hebrew, where he is filtering his experience through biblical reference points. So he talks about the book of Job and prophetic language. And he describes his writing, the writing itself, as an act of Melechet HaKodesh, a holy task, like building the temple in the days of old. A A brief word about Kaplan's diary. It was not buried in the Oyneg Shabbos archive. It was actually smuggled out of the ghetto by a man named Władysław Wojcik, W-O-J-C-I-K. This was a Christian Polish man who not only saved this diary, but more importantly, saved the life of a 3-year-old Jewish girl by hiding her. He hid other Jewish adults, one of whom, a woman, became his wife after the war and was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. And I'll read you these words translated from the Hebrew from Chaim Kaplan's diary. You can see the beautiful penmanship. We'll leave it up. November 13th, 1941. The journal is my life, my companion and my confidant. Without it, I would be lost. In it, I pour out all my heart's feelings until I feel somewhat relieved. When I am angry and irritable and my blood boils, when I am full of reproach and bitterness because I have so little strength and capacity to fight the vicious waves that threaten to engulf me, when my hands tremble with inner feeling, I take refuge in the journal and am immediately enwrapped in the inspiration of the Shekhinah of creativity, though I doubt whether the task of documentation with which I am occupied is worthy of being called creativity. In the future, let them evaluate it as they may. The main point is that I find repose okay, we propose for my soul in it, and that is enough for me. I'll stop there. He goes on, he talks in great detail about his wife dying of typhus. We can take down the slide, of the anger that he has against the members of the Jewish Council, who he feels just take care of their own, not himself, not others, not the greater good. I'm going to jump ahead because I can see we are running shorter on time than I would like. Beautiful things that are preserved in the Oyneg Shabbos. The next slide is of Yitzhak Katznelson, a name that may be familiar to some of you. He was a poet, a writer, born in what is now Belarus near Novogrodok. He began his career in Warsaw. He was working on Hebrew magazines such as Hatzfirah, Hador. You might recognize the name of Hatzfirah. It's a street name in Jerusalem, for example. And he then returned to Lodz, where he managed a Hebrew primary school and opened the first Hebrew language gymnasium, a high school, a secular high school. He has become famous long before the war for Hebrew poems he wrote, including one called Bigvulot Lita, in the borders of Lithuania. He wrote songs, fairy tales, dramas, and then was a youth group leader. And I mentioned this, you can take off the slide, just as another example of what I talked about at the beginning, that relationships from before the war were critical for life in the ghetto during. He continued to be a leader. Katznelson continued to be a leader of the Dror youth movement in the ghetto, and he became good friends with Ante Zuckerman, who's becomes one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Zuckerman looked at Katznelson as a spiritual leader, and so lest we think that poetry is just something sort of off on the side and not important, it actually was an important motivator that moved people to action. Actually, if we can put up his picture again, I want to read a poem that he wrote in the ghetto. It's called Song of Hope by Yitzhak Katznelson, and it dates from May 28th, 1941. This is translated. And I should mention that before the war, he was writing his poetry mainly in Hebrew. In the ghetto, he shifted toward Yiddish as an ideological statement. Here is the translation, Song of Hope. Come out, my dear, onto the street. Come and die on the street, on the hard sidewalk. Bring our pale children. Bring the eldest. Bring the middle one. Our third is very young yet, but like a grown Jew, is able to die of hunger on the street. Come on to the street. Come on to Karmelitska. Here we fit in well. Some fall, some stay sitting. There is a hubbub on the Karmelitska. Come out, oh, leave the house, the empty house. I'd be ashamed to lie there in a living grave. A starving man should not die lonely in his home. No cause for shame on the street. People go out, lie down, swollen, tight-belted. A whole legion dies together. They are dying wholesale, wholesale. We too will lie down on the street. No, not lie down, we'll fall. No, no, not fall down, lie down, heart to heart, and die. Die with the rest. And for those following in your packet, that's source number 11. Yitzhak Katznelson's ironically titled Song of Hope. Can take that down. In the few minutes that we have left, I want to turn to a couple of other things, to Lodz, Katznelson's former home, and to a diary of a teenage boy that I only wish could be as famous as the diary of Anne Frank, a boy by the name of David Sharakowiak. We can put up the slide so you don't have to wonder how to spell it. This shows, this slide shows some of the metal boxes from the Oyneg Shabbos archive in Warsaw after they were unearthed. Next slide, please. This is Lodz Ghetto, a workshop. Next slide. People, women and children foraging for food or possibly fuel for their stoves and heating at home. This is all Lodz Ghetto. And here, this is a paperback edition of the Diary of David Sharakowiak, available here in English in a masterful translation done by edited by Alan Adelson. I highly, highly recommend it. He is very, very articulate, thoughtful teenager. He begins keeping his diary on June 28th, 1939, so a couple of months before the war begins. And he continues writing in this diary until April of 1943. He writes about all sorts of things. Let's just hear him in his own words. Number 8, if you're following along in your source sheet. Actually, number 7 in your source sheet. He is writing here May 25th, 1941. It's a Sunday, and he's in the Lodz Ghetto, and he says, "It's May-like, finally. Those who are emaciated and starved, as I am, can't do without warm clothing yet, but overcoats are gone. It's dry everywhere. It smells like spring, and the heart breaks at the memory of pre-war days when we'd be getting ready for our long-awaited vacation. It would have been an excursion for the graduating class, then camp, or the country. Damn it, one could cry at the memory. The hell with it." Can take down the slide. It's just such a teenage voice. He is suffering things that no human being should have to endure, and the things he's grieving are typical things that any kid would grieve. The field trip that never happened, the summer vacation that never happened. Show you the next slide, which actually is from an autograph album that students in the Lodz Ghetto made for the head of the Jewish Council there, and you will see partway down the page, David Sharakowiak has signed it. This is a document that is in the collection of YIVO, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, and in his own handwriting. Here is what he had to say the day after the entry I just read you, where he was talking about the warm weather and the field trips he wouldn't take. He wrote, May 1941, "All is okay in school. We're working on Cicero. Next week it will be metrics. In math, we're doing square roots and soon solid geometry. In other subjects, except for German, we're behind. I'm organizing a school paper for which I've submitted a caricature. Maybe one of my Yiddish articles will be accepted this time, though so far none have passed the censor. Even the ghetto has its own bourgeois ideology. Not all is well at home. Mother works from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. and father from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The household chores are done by Nadja, that's his sister. She gets only 1 soup a day and has 30 decagrams of bread because she and mother both give father 10 decagrams, which he doesn't even appreciate. His attitude toward them is bad and shows great egotism." End quote. Can take down the slide. And that was number 8 in your source packet. So much of Sharakowiak's diary, of David's diary, just shows also family dynamics, that if you were a dysfunctional or unhappy family before the war, you would keep being dysfunctional and unhappy, and that those dynamics are only amplified in these extreme circumstances. There are many, many more sources in the source book that I can't get to. I want to get to just a last few to show other ways and other forms of cultural expression, reading and creating, that brought comfort or hope or some kind of life-sustaining sense to people living in ghettos. I promised you some dark humor, and now we're going to get it. One of the members of the staff of the Oyneg Shabbos was a rabbi named Shimon Huberband, and his specialty, among others, was collecting ghetto humor and folklore, jokes that made the rounds of the ghetto. So for those of you following along, these are some jokes. They begin with number 13 in the source sheet and continue. I think I've listed here 5 or 6 jokes. I'll read you a couple of them. Popular joke in the Warsaw Ghetto. A teacher asks his student, "Tell me, Moshe, what would you like to be if you were Hitler's son?" "An orphan." It's really hard telling jokes when you can't hear if people laugh. But another joke, number 15. Jews are now very pious. They observe all the ritual laws. They are stabbed and punched with holes like matzahs and have as much bread as on Passover. They are beaten like Hoshanas on Sukkot, where you shake it. Rattled like Haman. They are as green as esrogim. They fast as if it were Yom Kippur. They are burnt as if it were Hanukkah, and their moods are as if it were the 9th of Av. And another one I'll read for you. Number 14, I want to kind of unpack it in case not everyone knows Yiddish. So groschen is a coin, a unit of money in Poland. And this is a pun about the way to count 1, 2, 3, 4 in Yiddish. Rubenstein says, "I had a groschen, I had a coin, but I lost it. I had a zweier, but I lost it. I had a dreier, but lost it. Only the Führer I can't seem to lose." A pun on the Führer for Hitler, but here a 4 coin. So sorry, it's not that easy to do stand-up in this environment, but you get the idea. And the last thing that I want the last source that I want to share with you is number 23. It's the final source in the packet, and then I'll leave you with a few thoughts. This is a sermon delivered. So I mentioned that there were still religious observance that was maintained in ghettos, and Beit Din, Batei Din, Jewish courts, and rabbis continued to preach. And here is in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania, a rabbi named Zelig Kalmanovich, who gave a sermon here, April 30th, 1943. Zelig Kalmanovich was a linguist and a historian. He was actually not ordained. He was an early director of the YIVO Institute, and he actually became observant in the ghetto. In his journal, you can see his ideological switch. He's writing in Yiddish, and he changes to Hebrew because his linguistic orientation is showing how his worldview has changed. This is the ghetto preacher, Zelig Kalmanovich, what he had to say, April 30th, 1943, while we now know the Warsaw Ghetto is in flames. To be a Jew means in every instance to be on a high plane. The temporary suffering and blows that descend upon the Jews have a meaning, are not merely oppressions, and do not degrade the Jew. For a Jew is part of the sacred triad: Israel, the Torah, and the Holy One, blessed be he. That means the Jewish people, the moral law, and the creator of the universe. The sacred triad courses through history. It is a reality that has been tested countless times. Our grandfathers clung to the triad, lived by its strength. And now, too, the Jew who does not cling to this triad is to be pitied. He wanders in a world of chaos. He suffers and finds no explanation for his suffering. But the Jew who clings to the sacred triad needs no pity. He is in a secure association. To be sure, history rages now. A war is waged against the Jews, but the war is not only against one member of the triad, but against the entire one, against the Torah and God, against the moral law and the Creator. Can anyone still doubt which side is the stronger? In a war, it happens that one regiment is defeated, is taken into captivity. Let the ghetto Jews consider themselves as such, prisoners of war. But let them also remember that the army as a whole is not defeated and cannot be defeated. The Passover of Egypt is a symbol of ancient victory. My wish is that together we shall live to see the Passover of the future. End quote. It's often said that memory is what distinguishes human beings from most other living creatures. And indeed, memory is so central to our identities that when someone we love or we ourselves begin to lose it, whether due to dementia, traumatic brain injury, or some other reason, we often feel that we are losing the person themselves. And that is a profoundly painful loss, one that our society recognizes far too little. I wish that we could turn to some of these sources that I've showed you today to show how important, how central memory and chronicle and documentation and reflection are to our fabric, to our communal fabric, and to our cultural heritage, for some solace, for some consolation. I'm going to read one last quote. This one is not Holocaust. It is a more recent words from an English poet actually named David Whyte, W-H-Y-T-E. In his book Consolations, he said this about memory, and I hope that you will keep this in mind when looking at these sources and thinking about these voices from the ghettos that still come through loudly to us. David Whyte said, "Memory passes through an individual human life like a building musical waveform, constantly maturing, increasingly virtuosic, often volatile, sometimes overpowering. Every human life holds the power of this immense inherited pulse, holds and then supercharges it according to the way we inhabit our identities in the untouchable now. Memory is an invitation to the source of our life, to a fuller participation in the now, to a future about to happen, but ultimately to a frontier identity that holds them all at once." I hope that by hearing these voices that speak to us with great intention, with an awareness that they might not have a future, and that they hoped that there would be someone like us there to receive and hear their words and remember who they were and what they meant before they became victims. I hope that this offers us all some sense of inspiration and hope in complex times. Thank you very much.
We have some time for some more questions now. Sherry?
Yeah. Before, when you were talking about Musa Dagh, it seemed the way you were referring to Musa Dagh that this was a person, that this was a place or a thing. That's the way the wording came out. However, I could say two things actually. One is, which Musa Dagh, or are you talking about the one that perhaps more people commonly know as the one who was prime minister in the early 50s in Iran?
No, I'm not talking about Musa Dagh. I'm talking about Musa Dagh, M-U-S-A, new word, D-A-G-H, which was the site of a siege and a major battle and place of resistance during the Armenian genocide in the late 19 teens. So it does sound similar, but it's a place. So thanks for clarifying.
Gary?
Yeah, I love this talk, and it's really important for us to remember, particularly, I would argue, at this point in American history. But I also wanted to bring into the picture the writing, the recovered writings of the Piazetzner Rebbe, who was the Warsaw Ghetto rabbi, Kalonymus Kalman Shapira.
Yes.
They are a critical, absolutely critical preservation of a spiritual, of an amazing spiritual person who was caught in just an intolerable situation, and how that person struggled with their own, faith in that context. We all have much to learn from that.
Amen Sela. And for people who are interested in looking at writings of Rabbi Kalonymus Shapira, you can find it as The Holy Fire. There's really incredible theological discussions that come out of religious thinkers trying to make sense of a world that makes no sense around them and trying to sustain their flock. So thank you, Gary.
Edward?
Hi, very interesting lecture, thank you. I do have a question about science fiction writing. Stanislav Lev, for example, is a famous Polish science fiction writer who was probably influenced by the Holocaust. Any science fiction writing, any spaceships coming to save them, anything like that?
It's a great question, Edward. I'm not thinking of it right now, but there certainly are creative stories where there's some kind of otherworldly, and not religious otherworldly, but ideas that the physical realities will melt away and suddenly they'll find themselves in another place. I hadn't really thought about it necessarily as sci-fi, but let me dig around a little and see what I can find. It certainly has reverberations later, and anyone who's a sci-fi fan knows that incidents of World War II and Holocaust certainly have cast a long shadow over a lot of sci-fi writing subsequently, but I don't know during the time. I'd have to look. Cool question.
I want to bring us to a close. If people do have further questions, as Edna said, she's happy to stay on.
Julia, we're not hearing you too well.
You're not hearing me?
A little better.
I don't know what's going on with this today. Is it adequate enough to hear what I'm
saying? Yes, that's better. That's better.
So as you said, Edna, if people would like to stay to ask further questions, you're welcome to. I just want to bring us to a formal close since we're at the end of the announced time. I want to thank you for sharing this beautiful, really moving and thought-provoking material with us. And I think it was Gary who said this. I was thinking along the same lines, just how it really makes me reflect on where we are now and what kind of record we're producing. Both in terms of the pandemic that's being experienced in so many ways by so many different people, and now the racial issues that are back at the front of our consciousness, and your session kind of reminds me of, there's a lot going around right now about all of the African American literature that a lot of us don't read, and the importance of reading it, and what a window it is into a different experience. And that's what I think you've reminded us of again today. It's that text that you shared of I think it was a high school student and reading Cicero. It's like it brings you right there into his life. So I guess on the most basic level, thanks for reminding us of the power and the immediacy of literature and how much it can teach us about the human experience. So thank you for this teaching. I want to make sure everyone's aware of our session next week, which is also on literature in a totally different way. We're going to be going back a few thousand years to biblical literature. And you may or may not know that one genre of biblical literature is prayer. There's quite a lot of biblical prayer, even though a lot of the prayer in our Siddurim is also from later periods. And one genre of biblical prayer is lament. And Dr. Alan Cooper, a professor of Bible at JTS, is going to be looking at some of those selected prayers of lament with us, biblical lament, to explore the power of that genre in a time of crisis. And it's kind of another literary lens through which to reflect on these times and those times and other challenging times personally and societally where literature was used to express the experience and to cope. So I hope that you'll join us next week, same time. And again, thank you, Edna, so much for teaching us today.
It was my pleasure. And I'm looking in the comments and I see that someone named Judy wrote, I was afraid this would be too depressing for me now, but it was moving and uplifting. And that was really, really my hope, to show you that even in the darkest moments, there are still things there that can motivate and inspire us. And someone had asked if I get depressed working on this material. I do, but I also see things that just dazzle me in terms of self-awareness and altruism and just, the inextinguishable human spirit. So thanks for the opportunity, Julia, and thank you, Tim.
It's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Take care.